Why do birds get lost? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, this is Jill from the North Woods, talking about nature right outside your front door. I was going to tell you about a pink bird nobody was ready for, and this is something that happened not too terribly far away from me. We had a bird that had no business being in my neck of the woods. It was July of 2023, and a volunteer was out doing routine piping plover counts in a natural wildlife area, and suddenly he saw a flash of pink out of the corner of his eye. He stopped, he looked again, and he started making phone calls because what he was looking at was a roseate spoonbill, a large pink flamingo-like wading bird with a bizarre spatula-shaped bill. And it was last confirmed sighting in this state was in 1845. Within days, birders were driving all along the area from hundreds of miles. 50 people would show up on a Saturday just to stand at the edge of the wetlands and look at this bird that should have never been here. Now, around the same time, surrounding it, something else was happening at a marsh that I just happen to love, and it's one of a regular haunt for me. A white-faced ibis was showing up every year, and not in huge numbers, but just one or two or three, and it was enough that the local birders started noticing the pattern. I went and saw him too, standing there, looking at these dark, iridescent wading birds with their curved bill, and the bird belongs in the wetlands of America's West. And I found myself thinking the same story. Why are these birds even here? These were a glossy-faced ibis and a white-faced ibis. Why were they here? Did they get lost? And that's what we're going to talk about. How do birds get lost? Why does it happen? And what does it mean when a bird shows up somewhere where it has no business being? And if you're paying attention, we've been having some remarkable sightings of these kinds of birds in recent years. So let's get the language kind of right on this. We'll get what we call vagrant or accidental wanderers, and, they start showing up. Give you some specific word. A vagrant is a bird that shows up well outside its normal range. It has got somewhere it doesn't normally go. And that can happen for all sorts of reasons. The accidental is rarer. That is a bird so far out of its range that sighting it is essentially a one-time event, a true accident, waiting, for decades before it happens. That's that roseate spoonbill. It was an accidental sighting because the previous time it was recorded in Wisconsin was 178 years ago. Now, a wanderer is something else a little bit different. That might be a young bird in its first 1 or 2 years of life, exploring beyond where it was born and where it migrates. There's established migration patterns that we expect to see. Right now, it is migration in the Midwest, and I'm going out there and birding every day because I'm on vacation, looking for birds that are migrating through here before they head up north. This kind of young, disoriented bird following food or some kind of an instinct or a storm or wind carries them further than they meant to go. There's sort of an interruption of what would be their normal migration. And that's when a species shows up outside their range. And sometimes it can actually be a large number of them showing up outside their range because suddenly there is a boom of population in that breeding ground. Essentially, maybe food drives them to move and change their migration period. Maybe a storm brings a number of these birds to a particular location. And it can happen on a schedule that is kind of shocking. They can bring a bird, like I said, a storm or searching out for food to some remarkable places that had never recorded those birds before. So like I said, we're going to keep those words in our back pocket while we're going to look at all of them. So why do birds get lost in the first place? First of all, navigation is complicated, and young birds are basically teenagers. I always get young woodpeckers in my backyard, and they're always at the metal pole that my bird feeders are on, pecking at the metal pole thinking it's wood. I'm like, oh, young birds, they're They're just not all here quite yet. So how does it happen that a bird ends up in the North Woods when they belong in Texas or Florida, or maybe even the Great Plains? And the answer is that there are several different mechanisms at work. First of all, one of the most that people assume is that it's the weather. A storm can push a bird dramatically off course. A bird riding on the winds. So every time we get a southern wind or a southwest wind, we get a ton of new birds during migration season. So the other day we had a north wind and 100 birds showed up here. Then you get a couple days later and 12.5 million birds show up here. The weather is what birds use to ride the winds and make it easier for them to migrate. But a bird riding the winds ahead of a weather system can end up hundreds of miles from where it intended to be because the conditions just push them into that direction. Tropical storms, remnants of hurricanes. We've had some pretty big storms here in the North Woods, and they can sweep up these coastal systems, grab some of these oceanic birds, and put them deep into the interior of North America, which is just a genuinely astonishing way of getting vagrants in areas that they just don't belong. These displaced birds then will find food and look for a habitat that they can recognize. If the winds are strong enough, the bird can get caught mid-migration and go wherever the wind takes it. When Hurricane Laura came through in August of 2020, essentially the magnificent frigatebirds, birds that belong over warm tropical ocean water, and they almost never touch land, turned up over the Mississippi River near the Missouri-Illinois border. That is so far inland as Tulsa, Oklahoma started getting these birds. These birds are not birds that wander. They were swept by a storm, carried by winds that they couldn't escape, deposited somewhere that they probably never recorded that species before, and left to figure out where they could go to get back to where they expected to be. Birders knew how to go looking for them because experienced watchers have learned that major storms inland will attract birds that they've never seen, and those birds then will head to the largest body of water they can find, usually in the morning, looking for something that they recognize. So people will go out and look for these very rare sightings of birds. There's also a genetic mechanism in this as well. Some vagrancies occur, it is not random at all, not because of a storm. There's an inherited gene in some birds that give them the track that they're supposed to take through migration. There's a small European bird called the blackcap warbler, and it was one of the most important case studies that they had in migrations. And what happens is that the researchers bred two populations of these birds together. In Europe, there's a geographic dividing line, east and west. We have that too in North America. There are birds that are considered to be east birds, and that includes basically everything east of the Rocky Mountains. And then there's western birds that are everything west of the Rocky Mountains. Just like we would have western chickadees, we have eastern chickadees. Same thing in Europe, right? They have these black caps. They migrate southeast in the autumn, and west of it, they'll go southwest. So there's two different populations of the same species, but they have a different compass built into their heads through genetics. So even if they meet at a specific location during the summer months, they will then eventually go southwest or southeast when they migrate back to their locations. In the 1990s, researchers then crossbred these birds from each side of captivity, and then the offsprings were raised in total isolation, so they had no parents to follow, no experienced birds to imitate. And when tested, the birds went the exact pattern that their parents had gone, even though they didn't have any parental guidance. The compass heading averaged out in the pairs, and the researchers concluded the evidence that the migratory directions is written into their genome and encoded in just a handful of genes. And so what does that mean for vagrancy? It means that there's a bird's internal compass that is not based, like I said, on its parents' training or looking at older birds or other birds that are there. It is completely based on something that's internal to them and part of their genetic makeup. And when the bird's internal compass misfires and sends it the wrong direction, an error can occur. So a young bird flying in the wrong direction isn't maybe making a mistake in the human sense. It's executing a program that's innately built into them, and their program has a bug. The second mechanism is that there's a magnetic compass inside of birds, and they can detect north and south. And it could be that the magnetic compass has an error. And this one's really fascinating. Birds navigating the Earth's magnetic field is one of the cues that they use to migrate. But the system isn't perfect. The birds experience what is called a mirror image misinformation, and they end up flying in exactly the opposite direction that they should be going. And it's almost like they're reading the compass backwards. And so that bird should be heading southwest, ends up going northeast. And it's a systematic problem that happens with some of the birds, and it produces some of these vagrants that are going in the wrong direction. The third mechanism is one that the UW-Madison wildlife ecologist invoked when he was asking about that roseate spoonbill that ended up in Wisconsin. He compared the juvenile bird to a 16-year-old driver. He says that they know how to drive, they just don't know how to go where they want to go. Young birds in their first few years have the hardware to fly, the instinct to fly, the fuel-burning mechanism to migrate. They just haven't refined the software yet to know where they're going. They haven't made the trips enough times to have it locked in. They overshoot, they go the wrong direction, they drift a little bit this way or that way, and they follow the wrong birds sometimes to the wrong landforms. And they end up somewhere else, and sometimes it's pretty spectacular. And so the fourth mechanism is population pressure. When a species had a very good breeding year, bumper crop of whatever bird it is, as ornithologists like to call it, there's suddenly more young birds competing for limited resources. And that pushes them further away from their normal population. Roseate spoonbill has already been showing up in unusual numbers in the Great Lakes and New England 2018, 2021, before the bird arrived to Wisconsin in 2023. Those events aren't necessarily random. They reflect a population large enough that it starts edging further and further north. And so when we take a look at those ibises were birds that would go to Utah, Nevada, Oregon, into Mexico. And they were birds that were in interior marshes in the United States. They were never supposed to be, or they were never in Wisconsin. But then suddenly in 2019, the same year that the glossy ibis started showing up from the Atlantic coast and actually started nesting right here in the Midwest. The white-faced ibis was also present in the marsh in 2021. Multiple counties were counting them. And by 2025, the Southern Wisconsin Bird Alliance started writing about ibis sightings at many locations. So when you come and see them, like I said, initially it was just a few of them, then there were a lot of them. One time's an accident, but now the birds are belonging here. They're in the marshes with the herons and the egrets, doing what shorebirds tend to do. They're unbothered, and the marsh has a habitat for it. Same thing with the black-necked stilts. They just ended up making a home here, and now we have many, many incidents where, like I said, I will see dozens of black-necked stilts every year, when for many years they were not even in the state. The data that was suggesting about these ibises that traveled to the Midwest is that they are regular breeders now here. They're returning. They're probing new edges of a new range. The black-necked stilt has a clearer vision. In 1991, they were considered an accident in Wisconsin. There were a total of 4 recorded pairs going back to 1847, and in 1999, the first nesting pair was documented in Horicon Marsh, and by recent counts, 30 individuals were present in a single season at Horicon. I was just there, like I said, I'm on vacation, and I counted 14 birds there. So this is not a bird getting lost. This is a bird that found a new location that is habitable to them and makes a great home for them. So whether they're pushing northwards or they're pushing eastwards or westwards, the habitat quality fluctuates year over year, and those factors line up to make Northwoods Wetlands hospital for birds that historically have never been here. That's what birds do. And it's because the food is here, the safety is here, their habitat is here, and it makes a good new home. This is what helps keep populations of birds up. And so it is an important thing for their success. So I want to zoom out for a minute and say something that those of you who might be birders that are regular looking for it. What's happening here in the Midwest right now with the spoonbill, the ibis, the stilts, and other species that I haven't even mentioned yet is a reminder that a bird list for any place is not fixed. It's not a closed document. It's a living record that changes year after year or decade after decade and generation after generation. And the birds that your grandparents may be birded for are not exactly the same birds that you're going to find today. Some have declined, some have moved north, some have moved south, and a few have shown up in directions that they weren't even expected. Now, every once in a while, a bird lands in the wrong state or a species starts nesting somewhere new, and it changes the record permanently. We have tools now that make this visible in ways that weren't even possible 20 years ago. eBird is essentially a continuous crowdsourced map of where birds are, what birds are showing up in places, and is updated in real time by millions of observers. When a rare bird shows up, it gets documented within hours. I'm witnessing that right now. The network of birders sharing information meant that spoonbill in Wisconsin got statewide recognition by the end of the day. And over time, those records accumulate. Before, think about it, before the computer age, if a spoonbill showed up, there would be some people in a town that would hear about it and they'd go look at it. Now we all know about it. And we can all share that information with scientists who are tracking it. We now are starting to get a record that accumulates all sorts of data about how ranges are shifting, species are expanding, and contacting other locations that they maybe have never been before. I think about those wetlands and places I like to go. These wetlands are often big enough, wet enough food for a lot of additional life that's here. And so, in a sense, these functional changes that happen to birds are like sentinels, a place where you can see changes in the regional birds in the community play out. And if something unusual moves through, chances are someone will stop and see it, and it will get recorded, and people will start to understand them a little bit better. You don't even have to drive to big marshes and wetlands or large federal lands to look at them. Sometimes you'll see them in your backyard, your local park, your nearest retention pond, and you'll see maybe something quite unexpected. And when you log a bird, particularly if you log it in eBird, you're going to be contributing to that record. And sometimes it'll surprise everyone. A few things I wanted for you to walk away from this episode with is that when a bird shows up unexpected, there might be a reason for it. It might be a storm. It might be that it's a young bird who hasn't figured out navigation yet. Or it might be that the population has grown large enough that it's pushing the edges of where it goes. It might be the early sign of a range expansion. The reason really does matter. It will tell you exactly what you're looking at and if it's just a once-in-a-lifetime accident or the beginning of something different that maybe is going to change forever. If you're genuinely interested in looking for these places, eBird is a great place to look, a way to look at the records of what people have been seeing. And like I said, we've been seeing birds up here in the North Woods that would be unthinkable a generation ago. And so it's a great chance for you to go ahead and log into eBird. It's a free account. It takes 5 minutes to set up and submit a checklist. And then you're participating in being a citizen scientist, giving scientists a set of data so they can understand what is being seen, where birds are at, where they're showing up and when they're showing up. And you don't even have to be an expert to do it. All you have to do is just pay attention and log it into this app. That spoonbill that landed here in the Midwest years ago was seen, like I said, by someone who was doing it. He almost didn't stop. The bird was just a flash of pink in his vision. And that's how nature kind of works. They're here, And if you're paying attention, and maybe sometimes if you're not in the place that you thought you were going to go, it just shows up. And then you see something that hasn't been seen in a state for 178 years. One of the interesting things for me is the other day, so my friend, like I said, and I are going bird watching during my vacation. So we saw a bird and recorded it in eBird, and then my friend got a note back saying that bird's not in your area yet. It's probably you're misidentifying it. She sent him a screenshot of a photo of it and said, no, we literally saw it. It was here. And so it's a data point so that scientists understand, oh, this year, these birds are showing up a little bit earlier. Before I go, I like to recommend a book. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about bird navigation and migration, I point you towards A World on the Wing by Scott Weidensaul. It's an excellent book. It covers migration, the science of migration, the biology of how birds navigate, and what researchers are learning from tracking technology like eBird, and the idea that these state bird populations worldwide. It's very accessible, it's well written, and it will make you kind of look differently at how birds migrate because of what you'll learn from it. Appreciate you being out there. Jill from the North Woods. You can find everything I do at jillfromthenorthwoods.com. I would love to hear from you. You can put a comment right here if you're watching it on a video. So make sure you go out there with a pair of binoculars and a notepad and see what's showing up.